Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining. We'll just give it a couple minutes here at the top of the hour to make sure that people can log in and have access to the webinar here, and then we'll get started with our formal program. Great. It's good to see so many people logging in. And again, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Joanne Kilgour, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio River Valley Institute. As we continue to wait for everyone to join, I'd like to cover just a couple of technical notes. The first is that we will be recording this session for those who are not able to join live. And following the briefing, we'll send out a copy of the recording as well as the slide decks that are presented here for your reference. In addition, we have enabled closed captioning for the event for accessibility. So if you'd like to turn on captions, there should be a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enable that function. And a big thank you to Ben Hunkler, the communications manager for the Ohio River Valley Institute, who's coordinated this event and who's on here today in case you have any technical issues with the meeting. The format of today's event will begin with remarks from our panelists, and after that, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. If you do have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A or chat function, and I'll do my best to see that we get through as many questions as we can in the time allotted. If there are questions that we don't have time to address during the event, we will document them and we'll be sure to follow up with you directly and share resources to the whole list. All right. Well, here we go. Thank you all for joining us today as we release our new report, an economic impact analysis of a planned plastics pyrolysis facility in Follansbee, West Virginia. Today's report provides an independent analysis of the proposed plastics pyrolysis facility and assesses the potential economic benefits and environmental harms to the region, including a review of the basic theory of how economic development projects can create different types of jobs, and an analysis of how this planned project could impact the community and economy of Follansbee and Greater Brooke County. We're joined today by the author of this report, ORVI senior researcher and economist Nick Messenger, and by Dr. Veena Singla, an environmental health researcher with the University of California, San Francisco, who will add insights from her research on pyrolysis and environmental health. As a senior researcher with the Ohio River Valley Institute, Nick Messenger focuses on applying data science and economic modeling to local economic development policy, energy economics, and clean energy transition issues. He also researches and writes about housing and education economic policy. Nick is a Ph.D. candidate in agricultural, environmental, and development economics at The Ohio State University, where he also earned his master's in the field. Prior to research, Nick taught high school, chemistry, and physics across 3 states in the Midwest and Gulf regions. Thanks so much, Nick. We're also joined by Veena Singla, an affiliate with the University of California, San Francisco program on reproductive health and the environment. Dr. Singla's work seeks to address health disparities linked to harmful environmental exposures using an interdisciplinary approach incorporating environmental health, exposure science, public health, and policy expertise. Her research investigates how toxic chemicals and harmful environmental exposures threaten the health of vulnerable populations, including pregnant women, children, and workers. She currently serves on the US EPA Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee and the Board of Directors for Clean Production Action. Thank you both for joining us, and now I'm very pleased to turn the mic over to Nick Messenger. Nick?
Yeah. Thanks, Joanne. And thanks everyone for joining us today. It is not easy on a Tuesday or any day to get a bunch of folks on a call to talk about economic analysis and jobs and tax revenue and all of those topics. But I think that speaks to the importance of trying to ask questions and understand these proposals as they kind of pop up around the region. So my presentation here is going to focus on the core of the report that we just released at the Ohio River Valley Institute, which focuses on the economic and fiscal impacts of this proposed project. So Ben, if we kind of go to slide one, a couple things that are important is when we talk about this project, we kind of have to frame it of where is this occurring in the context of this movement towards chemical recycling around the country. And ORVI and many other organizations have done work around, the broader trend towards chemical recycling, pyrolysis, and these types of facilities. And so this proposal for Follansbee comes as other plant operators in the region for chemical recycling and pyrolysis facilities have kind of struggled to become financially viable. When we started this research project, we really kind of dug into the peers, and we wanted to look at peers specifically in kind of the Midwest and Appalachian region to kind of be comparable. So the ones that sprung out in our region are in Ohio and Indiana. And really, a lot of the news stories around these peers have focused on their ability to repay bond debt that they used for the construction of the facility, and the struggles they've had both finishing construction on time and becoming operational. So, right from the get-go, we kind of are framing this as okay, so some of the other regions have attempted this type of project and have hit kind of barriers. Are we going to encounter similar barriers here, or maybe we might not? And other regions have solved these problems, right? As a researcher, I'm coming into this saying, okay, does this set the stage for improvement, or does this kind of be a bellwether for it's not going to work out really either here? A couple of the major ones I want to highlight are the subsidiaries from Brightmark, which is the largest one in the region in Ashley, Indiana, defaulted on bonds and filed for bankruptcy earlier this year. It was reported that the company would sell the pyrolysis facility to pay off the bond debt, but actually Brightmark stepped into its subsidiaries and made a $14 million offer to retain the facility. Court documents from that bankruptcy filing proceeding revealed that that facility was only operating at about 5% of its constructed capacity. There are a couple other companies in the region, including PureCycle, which is not a pyrolysis facility, but a chemical recycling facility that uses a slightly different technology. In my state, home state of Ohio, and the financial filings there revealed that $280 million losses last year, following $100 million in 2023. Earlier this year, they reported revenue for the first time, and as we'll find, this came after a pretty large debt financing run and after a really long construction phase, right? So let's situating this proposal for Follansbee kind of in this context of similar projects around the region have really run into trouble, both financial and technical trouble, as they've worked to become operational on this kind of idea and business plan. Ben, if we kind of go to the next slide. So knowing that and understanding the context that this proposal is coming in, we really wanted to ask two questions. What are the economic impacts? How many jobs might this thing create, right? The purported benefit for the community is if it creates jobs, that could improve the local economy. And the fiscal impacts. If you're a person who lives in this part of the state, then you're looking at, okay, is my county getting any additional tax revenue to fund other public services, to fund our schools, to fund our roads, right? Is there going to be a benefit to us there at the public level? And certainly the state of West Virginia, is the state going to benefit in any way from this? Are other taxpayers going to benefit around the state, especially since the bonds were facilitated by the West Virginia Economic Development Authority? So when we talk economic impacts, we're talking jobs. And when we talk fiscal impacts, we're talking tax revenue changes. Ben, if we go to the next slide. So I want to pause here for just a quick second and make sure that I'm cutting through the jargon and kind of laying out what we mean by this. When a new project, whether it's a pyrolysis facility or chemical recycling or a semiconductor chip manufacturer or an automaker, whatever it is, when they come to a region and they say, we want to do an economic development project, the core theory underneath economic development as a concept is that when you create jobs, you are paying someone locally to do that job. And that person's paycheck is going to get respent, presumably locally on their rent or mortgage payment, on food, on entertainment, on retail, on their car, on gasoline. The list goes on all the things we all spend money on in our daily lives. And actually, that spending becomes someone else's income. And so the idea is that if you create a job with a large factory or a large plant, that you pay workers who now get these jobs, and those workers respend their money, and it's like a washing machine cycle, right? The money keeps circulating locally, and it ends up creating more jobs. So there are three types of jobs we really are looking at. One is the direct jobs. That's sort of self-explanatory. Those are the jobs that are potentially created directly by the company that is doing the project. Indirect jobs are kind of associated jobs, right? The company's not hiring these workers and putting them on payroll, but these jobs are getting created in the supply chain, right? These are the truck drivers who might be bringing materials to and from a plant. These are the folks who might be doing the construction work on electrical lines to power the plant, right? Like these are our supply chain adjacent jobs that are related to the economic development project. And then the third category is the much more broad category of induced jobs. And as the word implies, these are jobs that kind of get nudged or induced into creation by that spending. So these are jobs at the local coffee shop where a worker stops by and buys a big coffee on their way to work. These are jobs at the local grocery store because now that worker lives in the region and is going to buy groceries every week. And so you pay a cashier and you pay someone to stock the shelves. So these are kind of the broader ripple effects of the economic development. If we go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, one back. There we go. So how do you measure this, right? If you're creating an economic development project, how do you actually try to say, okay, if you drop a stone in water, it creates a bunch of ripples, right? So we're thinking about this pyrolysis proposal as the stone, and we're going to drop it in the county water bucket, and we want bigger ripples. And how many and how big of ripples do we get? And economists measure that through what we call the jobs multiplier. And the idea here is that you can go back in time and you can look at, we have really good federal and state jobs data, right? Any company that hires someone presumably pays their taxes on it, and the federal government knows that that employee exists at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we can go back and look at how, when we create a job in one industry, how many jobs, start to materialize, and we can model that. And the multiplier tells us the total effect. So if you have a job multiplier of 2, that means one new job multiplied by 2, 1 times 2 is 2 total jobs. What does that mean? Well, I have 2 jobs from this project. One was the one I created. And so one other job was created out in the economy, right? And in our data, this could be fractions, right? We measure in time in terms of employee hours. So you could have one other job. It could be, 75% full-time employment for a truck driver in the region, and it could be 25% full-time employment for 25% of the time spent for a cashier at the local grocery store, right? The idea is that you're measuring the total impact. A lot of available jobs data research shows that these impacts are really different across industries. Not all industries are the same. So getting an automaker versus a pyrolysis plant versus a chip manufacturer versus a new retail store, those all have different multipliers. And these are driven by wage differences. And then around the country, they're going to be driven by, okay, well, if you build an auto plant in the Midwest, you have a lot of other auto plants nearby, right? If you build a tech company on the West Coast, there's a lot of tech companies on the West Coast, and maybe that's easier to hire employees than relocating them, right? So a lot of these kind of geographic differences and historical, economic, and industry trends really impact how big of a ripple you make by dropping the stone. So if we go to the next slide, the actual technical aspect, and I'll try not to bore everybody here for a second, but the technical way that we do this is through modeling. And one of those approaches is called an input-output model. So this model looks at the relationship between industries across all of the industries in the country. And I kind of compare it to those slide puzzles, right? If you pull one lever or you slide one piece, all the other pieces start sliding in response to what you did, right? So you kind of move one industry and say, okay, let's hypothetically increase employment in the chemical industry. What does that do to all the other industries in my picture, right? And we can do a really big complex matrix and we can have all of these pieces move, but it's all underpinned by real life jobs data, right, in the past. So we can go back in 2024 and 2023 and 2022 and see how these industries employment were connected in the past, and that might give us some insight to the future. IMPLAN is a company that does input-output modeling software, and there are other companies that have this type of software available, and it's kind of standardly used by industry. A lot of times, if you read any type of industry report in most industries and they do economic modeling, they're often using IMPLAN as their input-output model software. That's just the name of the company that does it. A couple things I want to highlight is this approach has weaknesses, whether it's the fact that it's a static model, right? It provides a snapshot. So we use 2023 as our data year, but if someone is using IMPLAN from 10 years ago, they're using 2013 economic data, right? And we know that links and changes in industries over the last decade probably change their relationship to one another. So you want to make sure you're using the most recent year. We make sure we're doing that here. They don't capture crowding out effects. So we know when we slide one piece and we create some jobs in this industry, it's going to ripple into other industries. But those other industries might now make new decisions. They might say, well, geez, we can't compete. We're going to have to scale back our employment. But they might also say, we can keep our employment. We'll scale back wages and price. The price of labor is the wage, right? So without getting too in the weeds, you're not self-fulfilling prophecy here. We're not trying to predict how industries totally change their own decision making. We're just looking at the connections between them in past data. The other thing that I'll come back to is that these largely ignore resource constraints. So if you model one new job created in Brooke County, West Virginia, you assume that there is an employee sitting ready to take that job in Brooke County, West Virginia. Some jobs, that's a good assumption. And some jobs that are highly technical, that might not be a good assumption, right? We could think about something like installing incredibly complicated pyrolysis machinery in this setting might not be something that any local worker is trained to do in the county. In that case, that job might not be able to be hired for in the county. It might be someone from outside of the county who comes in to do that very technical, a very niche expertise installation of machinery, right? So, that's a level of detail that we don't know because we don't have access and don't look at the company's private employment data and what their plans are around these things. But these are assumptions the modeling software from IMPLAN has to make. If we go to the next slide, I think IMPLAN's website sums it up pretty well. No economic model can account for all of the changes or predict the future, right? I am not Nostradamus. I am not trying to, predict with any kind of 100% this will be what happens. But we have to ask these questions. And we have to kind of say, well, this is what the evidence from the past indicates is a possible outcome. And then when we look at economic development plans, we have to ask ourselves as communities, is this the best use of money? Is this the best use of time? Is this the best use of land? Is this the best use of resources in order to generate the effect? Or could there be other plans out there that maybe look at things a different way or have a higher probability of generating jobs? So let's get to the meat of the study. I know I've probably put everybody to sleep. We haven't lost too many attendees yet, so sorry to go back to the big picture there, but it's important to think about. So our general approach here is one, we're going to look at what the company proposed. They've publicly commented many times about how many jobs they're going to create or plan to create. So we're going to look at their publicly stated numbers from various town meetings and various filings. Two, we're going to look at the employment stated from those peer facilities around the region. And we're going to kind of get an estimate of, okay, do these two numbers, are they in the same ballpark? And they are. we're going to choose to use the higher of the two numbers, which actually kind of gives a benefit of the doubt to the project. And we're going to say, okay, we'll take the higher employment estimate for those direct jobs and we'll plug that into the model and go from there. And then finally, we're going to use the model's direct, indirect, and induced jobs to look at the tax framework for the county and the state and say, okay, how does this change the tax revenue projections for the county and the state? What do we estimate the impact to be? So just a summary of the peer facilities. This chart adds Altera and Freepoint, which were two other facilities in the region that I didn't kind of hit in my intro that we also looked at. And we scaled their publicly stated employment when they were under construction to their capacity, and we adjusted that for the stated and planned capacity of the facility in Follansbee as it's been publicly shared. And if we go to the next slide, Ben. I'll give you the conclusion before I dive into it. We found this to be about 38 direct jobs based on the peers, which is a little bit higher than the publicly stated from the company planning the proposal. And the modeling suggests this is going to support somewhere between 56 and 63 total jobs. So you're getting 38 potential jobs at the site, and you're getting 63 total. So we can do some subtraction, right, to find the difference. And that difference will be the number of indirect and induced jobs. But the total job impact we estimate to be about 63 jobs. This is about 1% increase to the total jobs in the county, right? So this includes the construction jobs, those might be more transient. They're still very important, but we have to remember that when you're doing construction, you're hauling material away, you're bringing material in, you're building the thing. You know, after 5 or 6 years, some of those jobs may actually drop off as the construction period ends. But it's about a 1% increase estimated in total jobs that exist today in the county, or as the end of 24. This is a really hard to see chart. I apologize, but it is in the full report. This just gives you the industry breakdown. So remember, I talked about how you move one piece of the slide puzzle. In our case, that's waste management and remediation services, which is the industry code that IMPLAN recommends using for the industry that the company in Follansbee has filed all their permits under. So that's where you see the 38. That's the very top line in the table. If you squint really hard and I don't know, lean really close to your computer, you can probably see that's 38 jobs based on the peer average. The rest of the rows on the table are going to show how the other slide pieces move. So you're going to see industries like commercial and industrial machinery and equipment, 1.74 indirect jobs. You're going to see things like employment services, right? This is payroll, this is accounting, this is all of those pieces, right? You're going to see some jobs. And then you're going to move down the table and you're going to see things like the postal service, right? You now have to mail things to and from employees, or they receive more mail, right? And it's hard to estimate these things, but you start seeing that we get into indirect and induced jobs, and these industry ripples are kind of wider. But just like physics, I taught high school physics, so this might be where my understanding there ends. But just like when you drop a stone in water, the further away from the drop you get, the smoother the ripple dissipates out and becomes less and less volatile, right? And so as you get further and further away from the industry you're creating jobs in, you're probably getting a smaller and smaller and smaller effect. So this is the input-output model result from IMPLAN directly. Ben, if we go to the next slide. And all of those table pieces sum up to 63 total jobs, a little over 62, and we round up to 63. Looking at the fiscal impact, we see that the tax revenue generated, IMPLAN goes in and grabs the tax data from the census of local governments, from the state governments. It compiles all of this data into its software. So it's actually going to apply and estimate out, okay, based on these jobs, based on the wages that those industries earned nationally on average last year, and based on local and state tax rates, what would we expect the tax impact of this to be? And we find that it's about $27,000 locally for Brooke County, which is about 0.2% of what Brooke County's budget reportedly passed by the county commissioners was last year. The state revenue is about $250,000 annually, which assumes that all of the jobs are net new within West Virginia. And this is an important point. IMPLAN cannot tell us if there's going to be someone who lives in Ohio who takes the job and commutes back across the river to Ohio, right? IMPLAN can't tell us if there's going to be a specialized construction company that brings an out-of-state worker in to build the machinery and install it, and then goes back to their home state, right? And if those are the cases, then this 222,103 number actually gets even smaller because you're actually not getting a net new impact getting paid long term into the state. The other thing that could happen is if this job opens up and if these jobs open up in Brooke County, let's say the neighboring county gets, someone wants to work at this facility, right? Then that person is already paying taxes within West Virginia to some degree, right? Presumably, they're paying either property tax or they have a job in the other county. If you're just moving residents around the state's net new tax impact may not actually be this high, right? Because you're just going to move the taxpayer from one West Virginia county to a different West Virginia county. Certainly, Brooke County could benefit there, but the state as a whole, it's kind of starts to be more of a zero-sum game if that net new assumption does not hold that the model makes. So Ben, if we go to the next slide. And these two, we won't linger on these because they're really small numbers, but this just goes to show you how IMPLAN actually estimates these things. And so you're looking at sales taxes, property taxes, motor vehicle licensure, the severance tax in West Virginia, Social Security, employee contribution, and employer contributions, right? You're taking the job estimates you're generating, and IMPLAN is using last year's state and local tax data to actually kind of fill in, okay, hypothetically, if you create those 63 jobs across that collection of industries, what does the tax change look like for those new 63 jobs that you've created, and how are they collected? So this is for the state and for the local county, and a lot more detail on this methodology and is in the report and also available in all of the IMPLAN documentation. Again, this is a piece of software that's pretty widely used across industries for economic development analysis. All right. So, things that we didn't directly model, but are important to also keep in mind as you look at this project is we have not attempted to make any kind of estimate on the total cost. As I mentioned, we don't have full information. We're not, privately employed by the company, so we don't know the internal books. We only know what we can see publicly, right? And what's been reported in the media. And so there are, I think, potential concerns around viability based on the fact that what we've seen publicly is that we've seen the company close $40 million in financing through waste disposal bonds and facilitated by the Economic Development Authority in the state. But just earlier this year, we saw that there was a default on the first round of payments expected on those bonds, right? And so there's questions around, well, okay, we financed $40 million and then immediately missed the payment on those $40 million of bonds. That raises some serious questions about long-term financial, concerns around the project and stability around the project. And then Ben, if we go to the next slide, and we don't try to make any kind of estimate around, the projecting out the company's finances or anything like that. These are just what's publicly reported to, and available out there to kind of draw conclusions and ask questions about. And then finally, one thing that we don't attempt to estimate, but are important to consider is that there are externalities that aren't traditionally included in cost benefit analysis, right? So the project has been kind of billed as virtually emissions free. And I'm not sure what virtually means in this context, but none of the research that we could access publicly reveals any kind of details about other projects to suggest that there could be absolutely zero emissions from this type of project. And that has been found to be true at other pyrolysis facilities. And so one of the things you have to think about is that if the facility has emissions, then you have to think about there are costs incurred in the region that are not going to be reflected in the balance sheets in taxes or jobs or incomes or profits or losses. Examples of these potential costs are things like if you have folks with asthma in the region and there's abbreviated asthma cases, someone reports to urgent care, Are local urgent cares or hospital systems staffed appropriately? Do they have to change their staffing? Do they have other folks with medical issues who have need to be seen, have longer wait times? Do insurance premiums increase, right? These are long-term, very hard to estimate or put a dollar sign on effects, but they are logically existent, right? We know that externalities exist and that these are real costs that kind of get felt with those ripples. Big concern in our region of the country is loss of ecotourism, right? We saw this around other major developments and projects that if you've got hunters and fishers and fishermen and folks who come hiking in the region, right? And now you have a project that potentially has any emissions associated with it, right? That activity may change over time in a way that brings fewer folks through the region. And that can change local business patterns. There's questions about hazardous waste disposal and further refinement. And then one that's a little bit easier to calculate sometimes for folks who want to sell their homes is that there's a loss of property value and the associated tax revenue with that. If you build something nearby that folks find less desirable to live near, right? It becomes harder to sell your home in the future, or it becomes harder to get the price you want to get for your home in the future. And then finally, the one that's really difficult to estimate, but folks need to have it kicking in the back of their head, I think, on any economic development project is a lot of times we think about these projects as black and white. You build option A or you don't build option A. And the reality is, there are a lot of options out in the world when you think about how to use a piece of land or any kind of capital investment or anyone's time or knowledge or human capital, right? And so there is a lost opportunity when you pick option A in any situation. You are inherently giving up option B, option C, option D, option E, option F, and so on. And so it's not just a question of, well, it's A or not A. It's A, or are we giving up a way to use land or human capital or financial capital or our resources in different ways that might have a different effect, that might shift those puzzle pieces differently, that might result in a larger stone being dropped in the pond, right? And the different size ripple effects. And we're not making any sort of judgment call around, hey, should you do this or shouldn't you do this? We don't try to propose any kind of alternative here, right? I'm not examining, option B, C, D, E, F, but it is something to think about in these contexts. And a lot of projects around the country in every industry communities often don't think about the actual cost of devoting land and resources to a project, as opposed to, hey, what could we do with these resources instead, potentially? Because we are inherently paying that opportunity cost when we proceed with a project. So to talk more, Joanne mentioned I have some time teaching chemistry and physics, but I am by no means a technical scientific expert. I am an economist. So here to talk a little bit more about the pollution effects and potential pieces around pyrolysis at large, Dr. Singla is gonna take over from here.
Thanks so much, Nick, and thank you so much, Dr. Singla, for being here. We will now hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone on the webinar, and thanks so much for ORVI for including me today. I'm a public health scientist affiliated with the University of California, San Francisco Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment, and I'm also a senior fellow with Halt the Harm Network. I work to provide current scientific data on harmful pollutants in the environment to inform better decisions to protect people's health. And I've done research on chemical recycling and pyrolysis facilities across the US. And I hope I can provide some information today that's useful to inform this discussion. And this work is funded by a grant from the Schmidt Family Foundation. And I have no conflicts to disclose. So just a little bit about Halt the Harm Network, if you're not familiar with them. It's a people-powered network that connects leaders and supporters in the movement to halt the harms of the petrochemical industry. If you're interested in networking with others who are working for health protections in their communities, I encourage you to join Halt the Harm Network, which you can do at halttheharm.net. Okay, so what I want to talk about today, I'll just touch briefly on the basics of pyrolysis and plastics recycling. So we're starting on the same page there. And then I'll review the major sources I use to gather information about the proposed facility. And I'll describe what data on emissions I found in the permit documents. And finally, I'll touch on some additional health concerns before we go into the discussion and Q&A. Okay, so this is a very simplified version of any basic pyrolysis process that goes through these steps. So you take plastic waste, you chop it up into little pieces, you put it into a pyrolysis reactor under heat and pressure, and you get out three main outputs, gases that are also referred to as synthetic gas or syngas, a liquid called pyrolysis oil, and a solid called char. The heat source for a pyrolysis reactor can vary, but any pyrolysis process is going to generate these three basic outputs: the gas, the liquid, the solid. And the heat source to heat the reactor is often natural gas, which is the case for this proposed facility, which I'll talk more about in a few slides. So here's the major sources of information I used. It's the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection construction permit from March of 2023, and then an application for a new source review modification of that March 2023 construction permit, which was submitted in December of 2023. So I'll be highlighting some information from these permit and application documents. Okay, so what does this facility say it's going to be doing? Here's a quote from the application. Organic matter and hydrocarbons from the plastics are thermally decomposed without oxygen, forming a syngas that can directly be used as a fuel source for electrical generating engines. Okay, so what's the translation of that? It's saying more simply that plastics are heated, so the thermally part, they're heated to form a fuel that's then burned in those generating engines to make electricity. Okay, so one thing I want to dive a little bit more into is what is recycling? This may seem like kind of a simplistic question, but I feel like the word recycling is, people use it in different ways. So I want to explain the way that it's defined in regulations and in policy, and why it's defined that way. So this beautiful, colorful diagram, what it shows is at the top there, in the green, the raw material that you get out. So this could be trees to make paper or fossil fuels to make chemicals and plastic. The extraction, the processing, those raw materials go into production to make the product. So plastic bottles, other plastic products, those products get used, they're in the yellow. And then there's different options for what happens to them at the end of their life, at the end of use. They may be disposed, so go into landfill, go to incineration, the materials get burned. That means they exit the materials cycle. So those materials are no longer available to re-enter that materials or production cycle if it's disposed, if it's burned, if it's landfilled. But there's other pathways by which materials can re-enter the cycle at the end of their use. So they can be recycled. So you see there in the very top of that circle, they can be remanufactured, redistributed, their use can be extended. Those are all ways that materials re-enter the production cycle. And recycling, the benefit you get if materials re-enter the cycle and are recycled is it reduces the demand for those virgin materials. So you can think about, you use trees to make paper. If you recycle the paper, you have to cut down and use less trees because the paper can substitute, the recycled paper can substitute for that. So that's the benefit of recycling when materials re-enter the production cycle. If materials are burned, they exit the cycle. You do not get any benefits from recycling. So pyrolysis oil, that liquid that's generated from pyrolysis, can be used for different purposes. If you burn that oil for energy, again, that's not recycling. The materials are exiting the cycle. They will not reduce the demand for virgin materials. And the United States Environmental Protection Agency and in their policy definitions, other state regulatory and policy definitions, is for this reason that when you burn materials, you don't get any benefits of recycling. It clearly states that creating and burning fuels is not recycling. Okay, so now let's move on to what we see in the permits. The permit modification application lists 5 categories of emission units. And I just want to be clear that the application and the permit documents clearly state there will be potential emissions from this proposed facility. So I'm going to walk through each one of these different potential emission sources and the emissions of concern. So there's this macerator shredder. Then there's the pyrolysis unit itself, which consists of these different parts. The dryer, pyrolyzers, the gas cleanup system. There's those generator engines, which make electricity, mentioned before. This regenerative thermal oxidizer, and then finally this emergency flare. So we'll go through each one of these. As I talk about the potential emissions of concern from these sources, I'm going to mention a few different types of pollutants. So volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, they're linked to raising risks of asthma and cancers. Particulate matter, or PM, linked to raising risks of heart disease and asthma. Nitrogen oxides, or NOx, linked to raising risks of asthma. And then hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs. This is a category of many different chemicals. Some of these are cancer-causing chemicals like formaldehyde and benzene. Okay, so let's start with that first thing, the macerator, the shredder. So this is where the plastic that comes in gets shredded down into small pieces. And what we see from other similar facilities is that storing and shredding plastic waste can release VOCs, particulate matter, microplastics, as well as present fire risks. Plastics are quite flammable, and we've seen a number of fires at other similar facilities. Okay, next let's look at that pyrolysis unit itself. So how is it heated? Here's what the application says. It says natural gas for 6 hours during startup, then we'll use syngas. Okay, so we know to get started, it's heated by burning natural gas. Combustion of natural gas releases these VOCs, particulate matter, NOx, as well as other pollutants of concern. Then we'll use syngas. So that's syngas that's created from the plastics. Some of it's burned to continue heating that pyrolysis unit, releasing similar pollutants of concern. Okay, now let's move on to the engines. So remember, it's talked about the syngas from the plastics is burned to power those engines, which generate electricity, as well as other pollutants of concern. So here's a table from the application documenting some of those pollutants. Again, we see similarly NOx, VOCs, particulate matter, as well as hazardous air pollutants. Okay, next we move on to the regenerative thermal oxidizer. So that's a very fancy name for what is conceptually a garbage disposal. All of the emissions from the full system are routed to this thing, which just further burns, combusts them for disposal. And that process generates a number of air pollutants of concern. Here in this table from the application, again, we see similarly NOx, particulate matter, VOCs, hazardous air pollutants. Okay, then finally, we have our flare. So what is this flare? Well, that syngas, that synthetic gas, we already talked about. Some of it gets burned up to heat the pyrolysis unit. Some of it gets burned up to power those engines that generate electricity. But sometimes there can still be too much. There can still be excess gases generated, in which case they're simply burned away to dispose of them. That's the emergency flare. And we know from other similar types of flares that the same pollutants of concern can be generated. Okay, so I talked about some of the emissions that are in the permit documents. There's other potential concerns based on similar plastic pyrolysis facilities. We know based on reporting data to the Environmental Protection Agency that other plastic pyrolysis facilities report generating and disposing of large quantities of hazardous waste. There's been fires and chemical risks at other facilities. And so there's this Inside Climate News article, also this paper in Chemical Engineering Transactions that talks about risks of fires and explosion, and also odors. So Mary Beth in the chat earlier commented on the strong smell from Altera. We see that at other pyrolysis facilities. This Intercept article, Garbage in, Toxics Out, is reporting on a plastics pyrolysis facility in North Carolina. And the reporter says, on the day that I visited the Braven facility and adjacent lots, a faint acrid smell like burning plastic was detectable as far as 700 feet away. In this paper from Chemical Engineering Transactions, the author writes that initially the local community welcomed the pyrolysis activities, not least because of the prospect of much wanted employment opportunities, but complaints about nuisance odor and noise gradually cooled the enthusiasm. So in summary, pyrolysis of plastic to generate electricity doesn't recycle plastic. It doesn't bring the benefits of recycling. And pyrolysis of plastic also generates multiple emissions of health concern. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing so we can talk more and answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Veena, while we have you, I'm not sure if this is a question that you have an answer to, but there was one question in the chat about whether or not the greenhouse gas emission factors for the fuel generated is known.
The permit modification application does contain some information about greenhouse gas emissions from a number of those emission category sources that I mentioned. So there's some information in there, but I would say it's not complete as far as the total GHG footprint of a facility like this.
Thank you. And then Nick, this is a question that maybe I'll help you answer, but we had a question in the chat about IMPLAN, and that IMPLAN seems like a great tool for activists and nonprofits, but obviously there's a cost and experience to use associated with it. How would you recommend that groups that could benefit from this but don't have the budget or expertise might be able to access it or benefit from it?
Yeah, well, so first I want to highlight that I am not intending to be an advertisement for IMPLAN, right? Because I think that there are, as I highlighted, you make certain assumptions inherently to input-output models, which have input-output models, have their root way back in like central planning, early 1900s days, right? Like, and so there are weaknesses to that approach. And so IMPLAN is not, and I hope I laid this out where IMPLAN is not an end-all be-all. Now, that said, it's often used by industry because it's easy to use, it's commercially available, right? It's plug and play. And we often see a lot of folks who aren't trained economists who understand what's going on inside the black box generate numbers with IMPLAN and kind of pump them out into the world with no context or no disclaimer, right? Around, hey, these are the assumptions that this black box has to make, that this software has to make to get a result, right? And to evaluate the result, you kind of have to understand the assumptions. So there's a lot of IMPLAN malpractice out in the universe, I think, first off. Second, by industry when they do these types of economic analysis. Second off, I think I agree, with the sentiment that groups at the grassroots level need some sort of economic modeling piece, right? Whether that is access to IMPLAN, because if you have one side of the stories being told with this software and these numbers and this, despite its assumptions it has to make, and then the other counter argument to a proposal doesn't have access to anything of like this, right? At this scale, that becomes kind of a lopsided debate. And so I wish I had a better answer in terms of how do you access it, but unfortunately, these software pieces are extremely expensive and hard to access for grassroots, and I think groups and advocates, and I think that has been a really big weakness and a really big advantage for a long time in the economic development space. So I don't have an answer in terms of how to access IMPLAN without paying, but that is the type of work we here at ORVI are trying to do and get out into the world to try to kind of use these tools to make sure that we're being transparent about how they work.
Thanks, Nick. And then we also have a question around whether West Virginia is one of the states that regulates chemical recycling as manufacturing. Dr. Singla, it looks like you maybe are nodding in recognition. I'm also happy to interject, but feel free to go ahead.
Yes, in fact, it is. It was a bill passed in 2022. I'll drop the link in the chat that defines quote unquote advanced or chemical recycling as manufacturing amongst a number of other changes it makes to promote chemical recycling.
And I'll also note that in this case, the specifics, we'd have to dive in and look a little bit more in depth at some of the tax law. But a lot of times you see these classifications have tax revenue impacts because different industries' capital investments and equipment and different pieces across states is taxed differently, right? So classifying it not only from an emissions and regulatory standpoint, but classifying an industry one way or another often has tax implications for the state and local governments as well.
Thank you. All right, so we also have a question about whether the impacts of the gas production to fuel the process included in the analysis, such as brine disposal, methane escape, environmental impact from gas extraction, trucking, etc., were factored into the analysis.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. But really good question. The short answer is no, in terms of the emissions considered in the permit modification application. Was quite limited to those 5 categories of emission sources that I highlighted, and one type of fugitive emissions. So fugitive emissions, what does that mean? It means emissions that are related to the operations that are not direct emissions out of a source like a stack. So one type of fugitive emissions considered in the permit application is the dust and particulate matter generated from trucks hauling things along a road, especially an unpaved road. And fugitive emissions occur from all types of equipment, wherever there's connectors, flanges, valves, any place in the equipment that is not completely airtight or sealed, or when materials are transferred from one containment source to another. So like transferring oil or gas to different tanks, from tanks to trucks. So all of these are sources of additional potential emissions from this facility that weren't considered in the permit application.
Thank you. All right, I'm just noting everyone's questions to make sure that even if we don't have time to get to them here, we do have them documented. The next question is from Randy Poklodnik saying, I've seen claims that some chemical recycling processes can produce or separate to get intact polymers. Does anyone have information about that claim?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. I think one thing that's confusing about the term chemical recycling or advanced recycling is that it doesn't refer to one specific process. It's used by industry as kind of an umbrella term for a number of different processes, including pyrolysis, which we talked a lot about today. But there's other technologies or processes included in that umbrella of chemical recycling, one of which is called solvent-based purification. It's also called dissolution precipitation. I'd say this is the next level of confusion, is that these technologies can have different names themselves. So the solvent-based purification is actually what is going on at the PureCycle facility that was mentioned earlier in Ohio, where the idea is you can take one type of plastic input. So PureCycle uses polypropylene, for example, and then you use chemicals, these solvents, to dissolve the plastic, and then you can use additional chemicals and solvents to separate away that intact plastic chain that's called the polymer, the polypropylene itself. So that's another type of chemical recycling. I'd say a few things about it. It's far less common than pyrolysis. The vast majority of chemical recycling facilities that are operating or proposed are using pyrolysis. The solvent-based purification is quite a minority. And there's questions about the viability, as Nick mentioned in his presentation. PureCycle has definitely had some financial troubles. There's a lot of issues with contamination. The plastic going into the process has to be quite clean and just one type of plastic. So for PureCycle, it's polypropylene, and other types of plastic in that mix mess up their process. So what we've seen is it just requires more and more investment and process that's expensive. So what PureCycle gets from a materials recovery facility, so for post-consumer, right, the stuff that we as individuals use and we might throw in our recycling bin and then it goes somewhere where it gets sorted. So bales come out of there. That's not clean enough for PureCycle. They've had to create a secondary sorting facility where they take those and then sort them further to get the level of kind of one type of plastic that's clean that they need for their process. So it's really sensitive to contamination, and the solvents that are used are toxic and hazardous. So PureCycle is a hazardous waste generator itself, and reports generating and disposing of hazardous waste to the EPA every year. So there's some similar concerns about that type of process, even though it's a different technology and process than pyrolysis.
Thank you. Nick, I see you're partially answering the next question that I was going to get to in the chat, but I think this is a good question that maybe splits both of your expertise. So we have a question about odors from similar plants and whether housing prices adjacent to those plants might be affected. Dr. Singla, perhaps you could speak to odors, and Nick, I see you've mentioned in the chat some about housing prices, but maybe just we could start with the question of odor.
Yes, so I would say there's consistently complaints about odors from other plastics pyrolysis facilities. So we saw earlier in the chat, Mary Beth noted that there was a strong odor from Altera facility. We saw for the Braven, North Carolina facility, the documentation of odor. There was a pyrolysis facility in Oregon that also had documentation of strong odors. So that is something we've seen from a number of pyrolysis facilities.
Yeah, and odor is generally considered in economic lingo what we would call a disamenity, right? An amenity is something you want. It's a big backyard or green space, or you can walk to, a diner down the street or whatever, right? People like to live in certain houses for certain reasons because of amenities, and things that are disamenities are things people don't want to live by or near, right? Sometimes that could be, I don't want to live in a flood zone. That's a disamenity. And in this case, I don't want to live near an odor, or I don't want to have sound or lights from a facility that runs overnight, if that's the case in some industrial parks, right? So certainly there's a lot of evidence that suggests, and home prices are things that are relatively easy to study because county auditors around the country keep pretty good data, right? Whenever a home is sold. So there's a lot of really good economic research that shows that when you produce sounds and odors around an industrial site, you typically have an associated loss of home values, right? And that poses serious justice concerns because it reduces home values. And if you're in a community where, who's actually having their home devalued by something like this, potentially. And then also, if wealthier folks in certain regions can just move away from it, right? The folks who don't have the ability to move away from a site face the kind of unequal burden of the odor and the sound, and also the potential health risks if there are emissions, right? So that kind of opens up the can of worms. But a lot of people really have researched this question of industrial odors and found a negative effect on home values.
And I know
Thank
we're
you.
right at time, but I just want to add really quickly that noise, people think of it as just a nuisance, but it's actually a serious health risk. We have more and more research about how significantly it affects people's mental health and cognitive functions. So it's not just a nuisance, it's a problem for people's health as well.
Thank you. Well, thank you both so much for excellent presentations and for joining us here today. Thanks to all the attendees for hanging with us here even a few minutes over. If we did not get to your questions, we have documented them, and we will be following up, as we mentioned, with a copy of the recording and the presentations. So again, thanks everyone so much, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.